Fantastic, fantastic. So, Shabazz, I reckon we go ahead and kick off here. Just
Perfect.
to introduce, yeah, I'll start out introducing Virtual Graffiti. So we're an IT reseller here with offices around the world. We have recently brought on a product called SmartEncrypt, and it's why we brought on Shabazz here to handle some of the file level encryption for us. What we would like to discuss with you on why today is why it's important and how it can better protect your data. There's been quite a few events here recently, and uh, we do think file level encryption could be helpful in some of these situations. But hey, look, we'll kick it off. I'll introduce Shabazz. So Shabazz is one of the architects or engineers over at SmartEncrypt, and he'll be walking us through kind of the product today and a demo. We would like for this to be as interactive as possible. So please feel free to ask questions along the way. And thank you for joining. Shabazz, over to you.
Thanks for that. That is much appreciated. So, yeah, welcome everyone to today's webinar. Like Thad mentioned, we're going to talk about encryption and why it's important. And what we will basically talk about is why it's a pretty simple way to mitigate a lot of threats in the cyberspace with minimal, I guess, complexity and minimal intervention, I guess. Um, so I'll just briefly introduce the product essentially. So what we've aimed to do with Smart Encrypt as a product is to make or utilize encryption technology in a pretty easy way. We see a lot of user resistance and basically in using an encryption solution. And we've tried to address all types of issues with it. And we've been considerably successful in getting it adopted across our partner space. Um, so why are we here in the first place? Let's just address that first. And what our business is technically thinking about in terms of cybersecurity at the moment. Um, we feel that the way businesses are operating has changed significantly in the last couple of years, in the last couple of months, essentially. More so because businesses now want to work in a hybrid working environment. And typically, on the back of COVID, it was more working from home and trying to make data available for your employees across the internet and make it easier for them to access that data and work from home essentially. But now what's happened is that we're more in a hybrid working space. Um,
And
and
Shabazz, I think one of the things that kind of confirms that is we see all the major firewall vendors kind of go out and push their own SASE
mm,
based products, right? Because the um, team and the employees and everyone else is moving, right? It's fluid at all times. Some people are working at home, and it's being embraced by the major firewall vendors. So this hybrid work environment isn't
exactly.
going anywhere.
Exactly. And the problem with that is data is now distributed. It's not in one central space where you could potentially protect it. Um, and since it's distributed, it makes it more complex to ensure that you've got accurate data access controls in place to ensure only specific people have access to it. So there's multiple issues with allowing that kind of work environment, and it basically increases your security risk for that matter. Um, and we feel that the easiest approach to protecting your data in such an environment is via the endpoints, right? That's why we're talking about file and folder encryption over here. And the problem with such an environment is that there are multiple points of vulnerabilities since data is spread across multiple environments. And the problem is also from a visibility perspective. Like, how do you keep a close view of how who owns what data across your entire environment, right? And this what we've also seen is that there's been a big churn of people leaving organizations, and we've seen people leave with intellectual property data that belongs to organizations, and it's been exposed to competitors and people in the industry. That's become a problem too. So there's multiple issues within within this environment at the moment, right?
Oh, it's everywhere, right?
Yeah,
There's data in SharePoint, there's data in Exchange, there's data on local computers, there's data on local file shares, um, you know, SharePoint, you name it, sort of thing, Dropbox, that all has company data and intellectual property hosted within it.
exactly. And with the current environment that we're living in, like you were mentioning the other day, that FBI has reported that the number of hackers have increased. It's like 50 to 1, 50 hackers to one cybersecurity professional out there. So there is considerable efforts going into um, protecting your data because of this very reason, right? Hacking and ransomware has become a profitable business, I guess. And it's not just normal hackers that are in there, or typical script kiddies. This nation state attackers that are not just targeting governments or your critical infrastructure, they're also targeting SMBs for that matter. So it's become all the more important to protect your environment, protect your data, protect your employees, right? Moving on, a few statistics for you. Um, we've come off the back of 2022, and there's more data around what kind of data we're looking at. Like, for example, there's been an exponential growth of data, and data is essentially the focal point for everybody. Like, your typical um, technologies like ChatGPT and your AI and ML solutions out there rely on this data. So protecting your IP, protecting this data is pretty essential. So what we see is that by 2025, the collective data is going to be 175 zettabytes. That's like 21 zeros after 175. It's phenomenal, and this data growth is continually going to be increasing. So it is very important to protect that data and to ensure it doesn't get into the wrong hands. And basically, Gartner predicts that by 2025, 45% of all global organizations will be impacted in some way by a supply chain attack. Right. And what we've also seen is that um, ethical hackers were able to discover over 65,000 vulnerabilities in 2022 alone, which is up by 21% in 2021. Right? And the other baffling figure or the baffling reason is that the human element is the most common threat vector. It was basically human issues or human errors or people who were unable to identify threats that caused 82% of data breaches. Right? Um, Phishing attacks increased by 61% in 2022 because of this very reason. And one of the largest DDoS attacks in 2022 was a 2.5 terabytes per second attack reported by Cloudflare, right, in the third quarter, just in the third quarter of the year. And there's been an increase and rising trend of random DDoS attacks, which are up by 67% year over year in 2022. Um,
And I think the other significant thing while we're talking about statistics is, the time to realize that breach has even happened. And we have some examples later on, but it could be 6 months before they realize that all of this data has left the nest, really, and is with hackers or on the dark web. And 6 months to realize it means you're not cleaning up really much. It's kind of already there and it's too late, sort of thing. Um, so
and one of the important realizations that a lot of organizations have had is that typically the thought process is that hackers attack larger organizations like financial institutions that have a lot of money to pay them ransom. It's not just that. Um, we've seen an increase in focused attacks on SMBs, and most SMBs feel that who's going to attack me? Who's Why is my data important to somebody else? It's not just that. So there's various reasons why hackers would target SMBs because they're easy targets, and according to these statistics, 43% of attacks were aimed at SMBs and only 14% were prepared. So it's lack of preparedness on an SMB's part because they feel that they're not going to be a target. Although large enterprises have more budgets on cybersecurity, they've got um, more preparedness, more resources to protect themselves, but SMBs become an easy and soft target. Right? That's why there's a concentrated effort to target these SMBs, right? Um, moving on, um, like I was mentioning earlier, that it's not just big brands that are being attacked; it's SMEs as well. And it's not just IP that hackers are targeting. It's intellectual. It's not just IP. It's basically customer data as well. Like, for example, we might have all recently seen the Latitude hack, right? um, there was a significant gap in the level of preparedness expected of a financial institution like that's like that size, where they didn't have an incident response in place to ensure that the correct data was um, or the level of attack that the level of breach that they'd suffered. They didn't know about it until much later. So initially they were talking about leaking maybe 200,000 customers data, which basically um, turned out to be 14 million people who were affected. Right? So this lack of preparedness and this lack of seriousness across the board is causing a lot of damage to people in general. Right? And there's more regulatory controls in place as well. Uh, we saw British Airways fined over data breach, which included a lot of data, 20 million pounds. So it was basically because of data protection failures. So this lack of preparedness uh, is should be non-acceptable, at least in the enterprise space, I'd say. Right?
Absolutely. And it's gonna come under more and more scrutiny here in the future. I think, we've seen the federal government here start pushing more. We want to be the most cyber secure nation there
Exactly.
is, and it's gonna just keep on coming and building on top of that, right? That we've got to step up our protections in every way, and file and folder encryption is just a basic way of doing those, covering those endpoints off.
Exactly. Exactly. And like I mentioned earlier, SMBs become soft targets, especially for supply chain attacks. And because of that very reason, it becomes very expensive for them to go through the route of recovering that data, their compromised data, and these are almost business closing events. So it's important for SMBs to protect themselves from these breaches, from these attacks, and take this seriously, right? Um, and potentially um, these have real economic consequences, right? So for an SMB to think that that data would not be important for hackers is not the right thought process, I'd say, because their motivation is a bit different. So now what we've seen is that most hackers' motivation is not just money; it's nation state actors who want to cause economic damage to countries. So it's the motivation becomes different from the group or the people who are attacking you, right? So it's not just money motivated, but um, um, causing issues to the country's economy as well, right? Um, moving on, this is a pretty good slide in that it tries to identify the type of perpetrators out there and their motivations, right? So typically we only refer to the ACSC for statistics like these, but this is a pretty nice slide that we picked up from the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity. And what we see is that nation states potentially have geopolitical motivation. So um, they might not just attack government institutions or government organizations, they might also attack SMBs or cause economic damage in general. So to think that nation states only attack governments is not right. We've seen instances where they're trying to cause economic damage by going into and stealing intellectual property from large organizations, like the case with Boeing, where they stole uh, plans for the new airplane and stuff, right? So the motivations are changing across the board, right? Typically, cyber criminals' motivation is to have profit in general. but that can be mitigated with the kind of effort that they're putting into hacking organizations. So they target typically financial institutions, etc. And but when it comes to ideological motivation, activists, they're not motivated by money, so they could target any organization not just for money but to cause damage. Similar with terrorist group, where they might cause damage and violence and not be motivated by money at all. So the thought process where we think that ransomware would deter, paying ransomware would deter any group into hacking, getting their organization hacked, or putting that data on the dark web is incorrect, I'd say. Right. We've also seen thrill seekers come out just for being motivated by satisfaction. These again would be your typical script kiddies trying to prove themselves out there. Right? So we see less of these and more of being motivated by ideological and motivations, as well as nation states being involved. And then there's insider threats. It's been an issue for, especially for SMBs, especially in this environment where we've seen a big churn of employees leaving organizations and taking IP with them. So we've tried to address that as well.
Hmm.
It's a pretty big issue, right?
What's crazy is the nation state one, and if you ask, like, I was watching the Risky Business podcast the other day with Andrew Boyd, the CIA cyber intel leader, and he's like, that's what keeps me up at night. And when the FBI did come out and say, we're outnumbered 50 to 1 here by nation state attackers, that is cause of concern, right? Because that's at the government level. Just imagine at the private enterprise level,
Mm,
they're outnumbered as well.
exactly. Just one example would be the 3CX supply chain attack, right? Which was in March this year. It was a double supply chain attack, and potentially what we've seen is that it was a nation state sponsored attack, and which uploaded a legit update on the CCX platform containing malicious code. And this then was distributed as an update to all 3CX customers. So 3CX again is used by SMBs. So this was a targeted attack to SMBs, not very large organizations. So this shows us that nation states are also involved in attacking SMBs. It's not just your cyber criminals, your typical cyber criminals, or your thrill seekers. It's nation states as well, right? So, and potentially what we've seen is the reason that they're doing is to cause economic damage. SMBs um, are pretty much what contributes to economies worldwide, and they're kind of like the heartbeat of the economy. So if you damage them, you're damaging the entire economy of a country, right? Um, moving on. By the way, I mean we've kept this interactive, so if you have any questions during the course of the presentations, please feel free to use the Q&A tab and to put your questions in there. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, but during the course, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A tab. Um, so why do we need to focus on the impact of cybersecurity? So a few statistics over here. Um, we might feel that um, there's not a lot of organizations that are attacked, but according to the statistics, 66% of the world's SMEs have experienced a cyber attack of some kind or the other. Some might not even realize it, that they've been attacked and their data has been exfiltrated. They maybe realize later on, but it has happened, right? And the other thing is that um, what if your organizations feel that their security posture is effective, and that's why they have um, this sense that they won't be attacked because their security posture is okay, right? And 69% have lost some sort of sensitive information, right? Um,
And
so
and that's from data exfiltration and
ex-
any sort, right? Whether it's an attacker or that insider threat leaving with it.
exactly,
And
exactly,
it's where the governance piece really kind of comes in.
exactly. So I mean, we've seen that typically when hackers used to deploy ransomware in organizations, um, it was just to disrupt business, right? And get paid to decrypt that data, right? So typically they used to give you the decryption keys when you pay the ransom, and that's it, right? But organizations mitigated that with recovering from their backup data and just starting from scratch. Maybe the business was down for 24 to 48 hours, and then that's when hackers realized that the data that these organizations own, if they exfiltrate that, it's sellable data that could be sold on the dark web to the highest bidder, right? So their motivations changed. So it's not just causing disruption to business, it's exfiltrating that data and selling it to the highest bidder. So these could be your competitors. Um, this could be any number of people who might find this data useful. So it's all sensitive data. It's all sellable data, right? And most organizations, because of their false sense of security, they might not even have an incident response in place. So 39% of organizations, according to these statistics, they don't even have an incident response in place. So that's why it takes a long time for them to respond to these situations, which is pretty important because once you realize you have been breached, it is important to know what data has been breached in order to report to the agencies, because people should be able to protect themselves, right? So before, like what happened in the case of Laddered Finance, where they were able to announce that only a set number of people's data was compromised, but it turned out that it was 14 million people who were affected. So, in order for the people to protect themselves, there needs to be an adequate incident response in place for people to realize that the data has been breached. Right. So
That
enough.
that craziest stat to me there, Shabazz, is that
Yeah.
57% of attacks weren't detected by endpoint security software. And that could either be, the AV wasn't strong enough, or is it just a straight 0 day that it couldn't see it coming, right? Just AV on its own hasn't been enough to stop these sorts of attacks.
Exactly. Exactly. So, and hackers have also become smart, right? So they know that an AV is something that most organizations already have. So they're looking for ways to bypass an AV, and there are ways to do that, unless you've got something more robust like an NGAV or an EDR solution out there. So, um, which typically SMEs don't, right? So, all the
Mhm.
more reason to prepare yourself for attacks that cannot be detected by a typical AV, right? So this is where SmartEncrypt comes in, right? So how we feel SmartEncrypt mitigates threats related to data exfiltration is that um, we've tried to make encryption a pretty easy to use technology, right? And that's why it's basically a next gen file encryption solution that protects your sensitive data from either unauthorized access, and we've tried to make it work for both people working in hybrid environments. So essentially, like we mentioned earlier, if you are part of a hybrid workforce where data stays on your endpoints, we try to make it easy for you to protect that data.
And Shabazz, why is encryption probably that most effective way to protect this data?
Um, we feel that um, encryption is the easiest way to mitigate threats related to data exfiltration, because if your data is exposed while you're online or while you're running your machines, if your data stays encrypted, then even if it's exfiltrated, the hackers can do much with it. But it's
Mm.
easy to recover yourself from a breach if your data is protected, um, because you can easily start from scratch. Right? But you've got your backup solutions in place, and you can recover from it. And hackers can't do much with encrypted data. So it's not sellable data; it's useless data to them, even if they are able to exfiltrate it. Right?
So it's a brick almost.
Exactly. exactly.
Hmm.
That's why we feel that encryption is a pretty good mitigation strategy for data exfiltration issues.
Yep. Okay. Cool.
So with Smart Encrypt, it basically has true persistent encryption, which means that your files remain encrypted wherever you copy them, move them, or email them, right? So the data stays encrypted no matter where you take it. So even if you were to email that file or copy to USB disk or share it on SharePoint or OneDrive, it will stay encrypted no matter where you move it. And we've also enabled external file sharing while your data is encrypted. So you could basically set a passcode and share files with people who don't use Smart Encrypt. So we've made that possible as well because data, for collaboration purposes, data needs to be shared externally as well, right?
Well, it's got to be easy to use, right, between organizations. Otherwise, users will try to circumvent it and not use the product, right? So,
Exactly, exactly, and that's why we made it easy for people to use this technology. We've tried to make it as simple as possible. Right, I'll show you a demo of how this works, but the idea was to make it easy for and seamless user experience for users out there that use Smart Encrypt. Um, we've also made it work with SharePoint and OneDrive, right? So that people who collaborate files internally, they're able to encrypt them as well and protect them. And and we know that it's not just single factor authentication that protects your data, your encryption keys. We've tried to introduce 2FA as well to give you an additional layer of security to basically identify yourself at login. So that gives you another level of protection too. Um, moving on, how does the product work? So it's basically a cloud-based encryption solution where you have the Smart Encrypt solution being hosted on Microsoft Azure data centers, where the encryption keys stay on a vault in the cloud, and an endpoint agent that basically runs on your machines, your endpoints. So right now we support an endpoint agent on your Windows machines, on Mac machines, as well as an add-on for SharePoint Online. The data is protected with the ES256-bit encryption, right? You could encrypt them on your local files and folders, on your cloud storage, or your network shares, or any kind of removable media. And it's encrypted with encryption keys that are basically kept on a secure vault in the cloud, right? And
Shabazz, we did have just a question really quick, if I could
sure,
pause you.
sure.
If Smart Encrypt is constantly encrypting and decrypting files on an end user system, doesn't that add a lot of computing load onto the devices?
So yeah, we get the question a lot. So I can show you that it's a pretty seamless experience. The agent is pretty lightweight, and there's barely any movement in CPU usage. But again, it depends on the size of file that you encrypted. I mean, typically in my demos, I show a 50 MB file being encrypted in like a couple of seconds without any overhead on the CPU as such. So I encourage you to test the solution and see for yourself. But yeah, it's pretty lightweight, the agent, and the encryption has absolutely no overheads that could be noticeable, I'd say, right? Um, the way that we make the user experience seamless is by making our agent available on the endpoints. So if you log into the agent, it gives you access to all the encryption keys that are assigned to you. So if you try to open a file, it automatically decrypts the file for you using the encryption key that is allocated to you. So we make the user experience pretty seamless. And with the console that you have, you can control who has access to what keys and what encrypted files. So we have a certain level of control that we give you in order to see that who has access to what and who can access your files and decrypt the files. Right. Um, so there's also a reason why businesses should be using encryption, right? Because unencrypted data is kind of like a gold mine for hackers, right? So even if it's behind your firewalls and your secure networks, which is not the case right now, um, it is basically it carries a lot of value for hackers out there because all of that data is sellable, right? And I guess there's no organization out there that is immune to financial loss or reputational damage. There's always brand reputation involved. There's always loss of business involved whenever there's a data leak, right? And because of this hybrid work environment, we know that perimeter-based protection is not just enough. Right? People work from home. If your laptop is outside the office, and it contains sensitive files, and you're not encrypting that data, then it's no longer protected because it's basically accessible to everyone that's out there. Right? It's outside your perimeter. It's outside your walls. Right? And because of the way the product is built, with the centralized console, you can control who has access to what in terms of encryption keys, in terms of data, and the encrypted files stay secure wherever they go. So it's persistent encryption, right? Um, Now, typically, the question that we get with deploying an encryption solution is that there's a lot of complexity involved. Like, how do you manage your encryption keys? How do you make your users adopt this technology? Because there might be steps involved in encrypted data, remembering passwords, remembering encryption keys, and there's usability issues. Typically, encryption solutions are not designed for simplicity, right? And there's also a high cost of ownership involved. So typically, people have to spin up some kind of a server and technical resource to know how the product works. So there's a lot of roadblocks into utilizing this technology, right?
Hmm.
And that's why there's not been a lot of adoption of this technology, which
I
we feel is a pretty big reason why you should look at smart encrypt. Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think most organizations have just said, okay, let's just do full disk encryption and leave it at that, right? Um, you know, that's where they draw the line. They say, okay, the disk is encrypted, and well, that's handy if somebody loses their laptop, sort of thing. It doesn't protect from insider threat or some of the other bits and pieces as well.
Exactly, exactly. Um, so a couple of benefits of using smart encrypt. It's pretty cost effective. Um, the effort and the money that you put into the solution versus the cost of data, right? There's a big disparity between that. So with very minimal effort and investment, you could protect your data against your data theft. And because the encryption is persistent, wherever your data goes, wherever your machine goes that has that data, it stays protected. Um, and The other thing is that it enables a secure remote working environment. So right now the workplaces are pretty fluid. People are looking at hybrid work environments, either bringing their own devices or working from home or using cloud storage. So across all these different data sources, your data stays encrypted, right? And we've tried to make it as easy to manage as possible, so you don't require any kind of infrastructure or policy updates. So it's a pretty non-technical setup. So it's easy to adopt and easy to adopt for either technical resources to manage the solution or people who use the technology, right? And with the seamless user experience, there's no special workflow changes that are required. It's a matter of just being aware that your data stays encrypted as part of an organization policy, right? So there's no disruption of some sort. Um, with Smart Encrypt, we've also developed workflows where you can specify as an organization and set up global rules that would automatically encrypt files across different data sources or different locations, right? So we could automatically identify a location for OneDrive where management would put that sensitive data. So we can identify who should access that data and then encrypt it using a specific key that only specific people have access to. So
Hmm.
even if you're running a shared folder that is accessible by everyone in the organization, you can identify specific people who can access specific data within that public share and encrypt it using a key that only few people have access to. Right? So that makes data access controls easier as well. Right?
I think the easy target for everyone too is kind of that downloads folder on your
Exactly.
desktop like that. It's the
Yeah.
easiest one to go encrypt because it does have, kind of everything in it. And for workflows like mine, stuff just stays in there.
Exactly. Exactly. So people collaborate with data. So you might think that if you've got sufficient access control on your file servers or on SharePoint, people still retain local copies, right? They download files, they put it in the download folder, and it's exposed. So once it's on your laptop, it is ripe for picking for any person or any threat actor to go and access it, right? Because there's access controls on where data is consolidated, but since once it's in your laptop, then anybody who has access to that laptop can access that data while it stays unencrypted. So we feel that the downloads folder is a pretty good target for a lot of people that are looking for sensitive data because people tend to forget that the data is there. So we recommend a lot of the organizations that use Smart Encrypt to encrypt that downloads folder. But yeah, that's a pretty good point. So that um, so let me just show you what the product looks like when you deploy this solution, or how an encrypted file looks like, right? Just bear with me for a minute. So one thing to note is that when we encrypt files, we don't change file type associations, we don't change the file extension. All we do is we add this small icon on top of the existing icon. It's an overlay that shows you that this file is encrypted, right? So I'm not logged into the agent right now at the moment, but if I try to open this file, right, um, it'll try to open it. Sorry, it'll try to open it with an Adobe PDF, but it won't be able to recognize the file. It's going to say that its file is encrypted, right? But if I log in and sorry, then it's going to give me access to all the encryption keys and allow me to decrypt the file. So it's make um, make it pretty seamless, right? So it's a matter of just using your existing AD credentials to log into an agent. And once logged in, it's a matter of just double clicking on the file, and the same process would result in a file being open, an encrypted file being open, right? So the user experience is pretty seamless when it comes to that, right? Um, and utilizing scenarios like encrypting and decrypting files, it's a matter of just right clicking on the file, right? And choosing encrypt, and that's it. That's how the encryption process works. And you could either open the file directly, or if you want to decrypt it, it's a matter of just right clicking on the file and choosing decrypt file, and that's it. So this is ad hoc encryption and decryption. Whereas you could also create rules to say that a file folder needs to stay encrypted on a user's machine, which basically applies in this use case where I've created a rule to say that all files in this folder need to stay encrypted. That's it. Automatically encrypts all the files. And like I mentioned earlier, the protect and share feature, which allows you to share files externally with users who don't use Smart Encrypt. Let me just show you how protect and share works. So it's a matter of just right clicking on the file. Let's say this file contains sensitive information. Maybe I'm a real estate agent that wants to send documents, sensitive documents to a customer of mine, right? So I use this protect and share feature, which basically asks me to create a PIN. So I could create a 6-digit PIN and save this file, which would basically create an HTML document or an HTML wrapper on top of this existing file while it's encrypted, right? So it's a matter of just sharing this file with the end user. And when the end user receives this file and they try to open it, this is going to open up in the browser. Right? And it's going to basically show this HTML page where I could click on decrypt, use the original key, which could be exchanged via phone, via SMS, or any other medium. Click on decrypt, and it will basically decrypt the file and download it for me. So when I receive this file, I could basically make changes to it, right? And put in more sensitive data when I receive it, right? And once I've made changes to it, right, I could save it again and also re-encrypt it and send it back to the original user. It's not just sending data while it's encrypted, uh, encrypting the data while it's being sent. It's also receiving it back in an encrypted state. So it stays encrypted during the course of exchange of the entire exchange of data. With this, you could either choose a new pin or use the existing one, click on encrypt, and it's going to recreate an HTML file for you to send it back to the original party. So we try to make the user experience again from a perspective of sharing it externally easy as well. Right?
Really, really important for those non-IT users, right? To be able to share. I mean, if you're in the finance department and you're sending stuff across the company, or the use cases are almost limitless. If you're have to report to somebody, financial numbers or healthcare data, etc. It's very easy to just send that back and forth encrypted.
Of course, of course. Um, Moving on, this was a pretty short demonstration. There's a lot to show in the product, but because we're only looking at specific things, I focus on the stuff that makes sense at the moment. But Thad, do you want to go through the features and the plans that we have?
Yeah, absolutely. So
Of
there's
course.
there's three different plans here for SmartEncrypt. There's the basic plan, that's really 1 to 10 users sort of thing. Um, Last I checked, I think it was about $6 a user per month, or somewhere under $10 a user per month. And then there's the Pro plan, which adds, up to 250 users and then 10 encryption keys, and then we go all the way up to enterprise, right? And there isn't significant jumps between those. We currently are bundling these with Microsoft licensing as well, so if you can get additional discounts on top of that. But the feature set, each one includes that role-based access control. Everything is 2FA. Reporting is across the board, and then Azure single sign-on is just supporting that Pro and Enterprise plan, right? So yeah, look, and then user import as well is Pro and Enterprise, because you want to import via AD most likely.
Perfect. Makes sense. Oh, sorry. So you want to go through the slide, Thad?
Oh, yeah, look, absolutely. The reason why we've brought on SmartEncrypt here is to help us cover off these endpoint protection products, right? It's almost an arsenal that you kind of need. We see RBIs coming to endpoints a lot more, and a bunch of different products. I think SmartEncrypt's a very cost-effective way to encrypt all your data and then implement low-level data access governance rules as well, right? Protecting what's most important right away, and then shooting it off. The network side of things, that's always going to be somewhat secured by our firewalls and some of the traditional foundational security pieces that we have. But this adds another endpoint product to your arsenal to protecting your data.
Perfect. Now comes the fun part. So yep, we're good to take any questions that you might have. And yep, please feel free to you either use the Q&A panel or are we opening up the mic, Thad, or not?
I think we just use the Q&A panel while we're
Sure.
here, and even if you wanted to log into the dashboard here for just a second and just show what it would look like if you have a demo.
Um, So we talked about the SmartEncrypt dashboard.
Correct.
Yeah,
Yep.
correct. Um, so this is what the SmartEncrypt console looks like. So one of the first things that you realize when you log into the SmartEncrypt console is you set up the global settings across the board for all your users. So you could put in settings like password policies, what your minimum password length should be look like, how many times it should be rotated after how many days. You could set up stuff like login settings because of the agent that logs in. Um, while it says logged in gives you access to all the decryption keys, it's important to note that you protect that agent and the user that's logging into that agent. So a forced client logout after X number of hours is pretty important as well. There's also support for Azure AD SSO, so which means you don't necessarily have to create accounts and authenticate just using the Smart Encrypt panel. You can also use SSO to authenticate the users. Right. And we've also added support for 2FA, like I mentioned earlier. So if you use stuff like Google Authenticator or Microsoft Authenticator, you could potentially also use that. Um, and you could also control um, users by either allowing them to do ad hoc encryption or decryption, or by just applying policies to automatically encrypt certain locations, right? So these permissions allow the user to encrypt their own files on their own locations using their own encryption keys, allocated encryption keys. And you could also allow them to either use protect and share or not. So these are explicit permissions that you have to give to users. You could either apply them to all users, or if you wish to apply them for a specific use, you could also do that at the user level. Um, and one important thing is offline access. So of course, in a usual scenario, while your agent is logged in, it gives you access to the encryption keys. But we know that there are scenarios where the user needs offline access. Maybe you've got a CEO who's traveling and needs to access the encrypted files. So this offline access feature, which can be applied at the user level, gives you access to the encryption keys and allows you to work offline. Right? And geo and IP restriction allows you to specify countries where the users are only able to log in and access their decryption keys. Right? So it's a matter of just applying these global settings and adding the users, which could either be done in a bulk user format or one by one. And also, you're able to sync with your Azure AD environment. So all users in your Azure AD can automatically sync with Smart Encrypt. And it's important to also look at groups because the way we bifurcate data and apply data access governance rules is by allocating people to specific groups because each group can have a key assigned to them. So people in the finance department will be able to encrypt files using the finance key, and whoever is part of that group will be able to decrypt them because they have access to the finance key and the finance group. So it's important to realize that people within specific groups um, have access to decryption keys, right? And
Shabazz, we do have a question here.
sure.
Can you exclude certain file types or files based on name/path?
So right now, the exclusions can be based on the path, not by name. So that capability is already there. Um, so when you create rules, sorry, when you create rules, you can exclude files based on paths at the moment. So yes, that is very much possible. Did that answer the question, Tad?
Yep. Yep.
Perfect. So like was mentioned earlier, you create the users, you assign them to groups, and when you create the keys, you can choose to either assign them to specific users or to specific groups, right? So typically we recommend to use groups for this purpose because it makes management easier, right? And because there's a limited number of keys that you can create with certain license type, it makes more sense to utilize groups. Right? And once the keys are assigned to the groups, the last step is to basically create rules. So when you create rules, let's for example, in this case, this rule over here, where I've specified, oh, sorry. where I've specified that all files in this folder need to be encrypted using this specific key. Right? So if I choose this, switch this button on, which means that any user throughout the organization, as soon as they log in, and if this folder exists, it will automatically encrypt all files with this specific key. Right? So if you don't assign it to a group, it assigns to everybody. But if you assign it to a specific group, only people belonging to the group would have this rule assigned to them. Right? So this is how the rules work. Um, right? And from that point forward, like in this case, because of this rule, all files in this folder for me remain encrypted. So I cannot decrypt them because it's part of a rule. This folder is part of a rule. But if I have access to the decryption keys, it's a matter of just double clicking on the file and opening it, and I have access to it. Right. Um, Let me just show you how the integration with SharePoint Online also works. So with the SharePoint add-on, which is basically available in the Downloads tab in the console, where you can download all types of agents. When you install this add-on on your SharePoint site, you could either install it for specific sites or throughout your tenancy. And when you install the add-on, it gives you it basically shows you this additional column in front of your documents, which shows you the existing key and the encryption state of the documents in a specific folder. Sorry. And also a button over here, right? So in this case, this folder over here, I have a couple of files that are encrypted using this key. So if I were to download this file, and if I have access to this key, which I do, if I try to open it in the web version of Word, it won't recognize it because this file is encrypted, right? If I try to open the encrypted file on my desktop app, SmartEncrypt would be able to decrypt it and show it to me. Right. So again, the user experience is pretty seamless, right? Because the agent is logged in and I have access to the decryption keys, it's a matter of just double clicking on the file and opening it. So any file that I add over here gets automatically encrypted because it's part of a rule. Right? So it gets encrypted automatically. Right? So that's how seamless the user experience is with the SharePoint add-on.
Mm.
Right. So I guess this is it from a demo perspective. Do we have any further questions, Seth?
Yeah, look, I think we'll just leave it for questions here for a minute or two, and then we can wrap it up here.
Perfect.
Does this conflict with antiviruses or anti-ransomware?
Not that we know of. In the initial version, we did see some interference, but that was basically 2, 3 versions ago, but not anymore. It's not a cause at the moment.
Okay. Okay, cool. And hopefully that answers the question for James. Um, anyone else, or should we wrap it up? I know we went a little bit over time here, but that's all right. Nope. Okay. I think that covers us off. Well, look, I would like just to say thank you for everyone for coming on. In terms of kind of next steps here, our team is available if you want to arrange a demo or talk further about encryption requirements. We can also do some security workshops with you to talk about file encryption or just general endpoint protection as well. So Look, thanks everyone for giving us an hour of your time today, and we look forward to hearing from you soon. Our team will be in touch.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Thad, and thank you everyone.
Awesome. Yep. Thanks, Shabazz. Appreciate it.
Cheers. Thank you. Cheers.
All right. See ya. Bye.